Yeah, I would say if they do, it would be considered like constructive criticism.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So it might not saturate and take down the whole event, but maybe there's something that you, so all right. So what are some things that people have attitudes about? People have attitudes a lot now about political things. People have attitudes about masks, don't they? You
Yes, they
know,
do.
yeah,
Yeah.
and very much in disagreement. And now the attitudes come to mean something bigger. In fact, we'll superimpose that on one of the ideas I did. People have attitudes toward COVID-19, and those attitudes are changing in a lot of places, right? Like people are getting, you know, weary, weary. I think I've read, at least I've read some articles about this recently. So when we think of attitudes, we think of specific things in psychology. We think of something with three dimensions. So first off, we tend to think of attitudes in terms of positive or negative in general. And usually they're evaluative, meaning they're judgments. And the judgments can be an attitude towards something. So we might have an attitude toward conserving water, you know, and maybe that attitude leads us to feel strongly about it, or to be bothered when we see like somebody's hose leaking or something, and to take action to, you know, not plant lawns and things like that, or to try to save the water that we're using for cooking and that sort of thing, right? So it's an attitude. People have attitude towards groups of people, or toward activities, or toward math. My goodness, a lot of people have attitudes toward math. I see that all the time in statistics, you know, oh, I don't like math. You know, I feel bad. I'm not good at it. I hear this a lot, you know. And so these are all attitudes that lead to behaviors. So what I usually think of instead of this word evaluation, well, evaluation, we think of the cognitive component. So it's what you think about it. It's like not you have to tease apart a lot in psychology, these three dimensions and a lot of things. You have to tease apart thinking, which is cognition, taking place in your frontal region. Affect, and it is pronounced that way if you're not familiar with the word, that's your feeling about something. Your emotion, that's in your limbic system. And then behavior in your motor system, things that you're doing, okay? Or at least things that you intend to do, actions that you take or intend to take. And so when we have an attitude, usually all three of these are affected. And if these are all lined up, it's great. Then we're consistent inside ourselves and we have no problem. So an example is just this exercise one. This is just to give you a way of thinking about it. This person has generally a positive attitude toward exercise. And her thinking, first is the affect, can't even see what that says, is she feels good about it. She says, I feel really invigorated when I exercise. I feel good. My heart races, it calms me down, it reduces stress. I feel good. Her behavior is consistent with that. Therefore, I work out. I get exercise at least 4 times a week. You know, it's very important to me. I prioritize it. Those are behavioral. And then cognitive, what she thinks about it. Well, she's learned that exercise is beneficial to her heart, and maybe she's learned exercise helps reduce the physical effects of stress, and exercise, you know, leaves my body in good condition and shortens my. So she's learned all this, right? So her attitude is good. And we can have a negative attitude too. And it's really good for us to be aware of it. And I use this example, and I don't know where it came from, but I had it in from last time. But let's say you have a negative attitude toward gangs, which, like, I'm talking about like street gangs. And let's say you had some sort of experience that led you to this attitude. And so your thinking might be, you might have a logical reason for it. Like gangs cause a lot of harm. They cause harm to the people they're trying to the kids who they're teasing to join their gangs. They're causing harm to the communities. They're causing harm to victims. So there's thoughts, right? Gangs cause harm. And then there's feeling, right? I feel angry and a little bit afraid when I see like a gang of what looks like gangsters. And then maybe there's behavior linked to it. I cross the street to avoid gangs, or maybe this person treats people that she thinks in gangs like with more suspicion, you know. or warns her kids not to play with other kids who she thinks are in gangs. So maybe there's behaviors that are linked to all that too. So, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, could you have a negative attitude toward drugs, for example, and that negative attitude could be beneficial? What do you think? I mean, sometimes a negative attitude could be beneficial because if you have, you understand the harm of drugs and you have feelings that are negative about a drug abuse, and then you avoid drugs and encourage your kids to avoid drugs. Like, these are consistent. So negative attitude isn't always a bad thing, so to speak. But let's think about where we go with this. Oh, I don't like that I have this right here. I'm going to skip this and come back to it because I don't want to go right here. There we go. All right. So what are the sources of our attitudes? Where do they come from? This kid, I think, likes soccer. Where do you think he got that attitude from?
Probably his father.
Well, his father, right?
Yeah,
His role models.
Yes.
Maybe his peers. Maybe at some point, his peers are going to encourage something that his father doesn't approve of. Like maybe his peers are going to encourage a kind of a phrase or a word that his dad doesn't like to hear. Maybe at some point they're going to encourage a game that his father thinks is harmful. Maybe he's going to start playing football and his father's going to be concerned that he's going to be injured. And so at that point, he might have some tension in his attitude because he's getting conflicting messages. So this is kind of where we're going today. So we can think of the factors influencing attitude formation, including experiences. I gave the example of a gang member, and picture if this person did, in fact, maybe she had a child who was bothered by gangs or who got involved with a gang, and that child ended up struggling. You know, experience is going to lead to attitude formations. Social roles and norms will lead toward attitude formations. So if this boy tries to comply with his peers, that may at some point, maybe in elementary or certainly by the middle school years, those social roles will have a larger impact on him potentially than his father's wishes. So that's another place attitude comes from. Going down instead of over, we can think about vicarious influences. We observe people in our environment. What are the adults around us doing? What are the people we admire doing? You know, have either of you had experiences observing people in the environment who have led you to act in a certain way, maybe a way that you like? Or had the reverse, people whose behaviors that you observed led you to act in a different way, or to act in a way that you wish you hadn't, like taking up smoking? Can you don't have to, we only have a couple people here, but you know, if you feel like reflecting on any of these things, like our attitudes really do influence us a lot. So I don't know I don't know how you were shaped, but the things that we observe in other people. For myself, I think of my own mom being very socially shy, like withdrawn, and not really socializing and having very many friends. And I think she'd get very nervous when people came over. And for a lot of years, I picked up that attitude. Like I would feel that same nervousness when people came over. So it's an attitude that I had, you know, like I have to do a lot of preparation if somebody's coming over, and I should feel kind of anxious, and, you know, and maybe in turn my behavior reflects that. That's kind of a bad one, maybe. That I would say I picked up. And then maybe a good one might be, I think work ethic. You know, I think my parents worked hard and I got to observe that and learn from it. Hi, Harley. Happy to see you. I have a good attitude toward you for coming to class. We're talking about attitudes today and the sources of them. So we talked about sources of attitudes being our experiences, social roles and norms, vicarious learning. And we were just thinking about the things that we've observed that might shape our attitudes. And then classical and operant conditioning. And conditioning are just behaviors for which we're rewarded or punished. We think of reinforcers as anything that happens to us that causes us to do something more. And we think of punishers as anything that happens to us that causes us to do something less. With classical being just associations that we have that form emotional responses. Like every time my dad comes home late, he's crabby and yells at us, right? Then we might have a negative response. Like that would be a classical conditioned thing. And we can talk about operant conditioning, which are, we can predict outcomes. And so we can change our behavior to generate an outcome. Like if I go over to my grandma's house, often she gives me delicious treat that I enjoy. And so then that would be a reinforcer for going to grandma's house. So that's what we think of conditioning. And I'm sure you've had a lot of Skinner and Thorndike in your other classes. Thoughts or comments on this stuff, like with your own attitudes? As we think about this, can anyone think of an attitude that they have? Let's say any negative attitude that you have toward anything. Can you come up with something? Thoughts, feelings, behaviors linked and negative. Even just one that we can kind of use to bounce around, or positive if you want to have a positive one. Positive can be fun too.
Let's see here.
Math? How does anyone feel about math? Just neutral, or could we have positive?
It was negative when I started the my statistics this semester, but now it kind of altered. I kind of find myself wanting and taking my time to actually process the information and actually getting the formulas right. And
Well, that's pretty
it kind of calms me down. So I'm like, whoa, this is different for me. So my attitude.
We've got to use this example because we talk about changing attitudes and what might have happened. So we definitely will revisit this. That's terrific.
So yeah, I wasn't that confident when I first started, statistics. When I would hear that word, and then when I went to my what do you call it? What do you call it? When you see the list of all your classes, and for me, I see statistics, and I kind of avoided it at the beginning because when I would think of it, it's like, oh man, numbers, and from my past experiences, barely passing by with like, a C or, a B, mainly C's on my part. And then now that, I'm getting to know the formulas and knowing what to do, my attitude changed. And so I was, I have a little bit more confidence now than I did at the beginning of the semester.
That is very cool. And I'm eager when we get a little bit further today to talk about that. It's already pushing forward. We'll definitely get to it. We'll go through. And that's great.
And then at the same time too, when I'm reading like literature, like that, these researchers have done the research, and then when I get to the part where I actually see their research being conducted, like what they did, the procedures and whatnot, and seeing the numbers, I'm like, oh, okay, now I know what's going on. Now I know what they did and how they conducted their tests and how many participants were here and the number of participants. And I was like, yeah. So my mind's just like, big old explosion in my mind. It's like, okay, cool. I'm finally getting footing into reading these literatures better.
Yeah, and that's a long haul because I'll tell you the stats in some of these studies are just take a lot. So we have one of an attitude that's changed, which is just great. Do any of the others of you have any that we can kind of play with as we're working through this content today? Any attitude that you have, or attitude that's changed, or attitude you wish you didn't have? If not, it's okay. We'll move on. But if you come up with something and you'd like to set it on the table here, that's great. So there's two questions we're going to ask, and we'll come back to ways of. Oh, did I hear someone?
Grandma's back.
Oh, let's just take a moment before we go on to look at how we measure it, just since we mentioned the research. So how could we measure attitudes? So first off, let's start with this one that says by questionnaires. So we can ask people how they feel. Rate your feelings on a scale of 1 to 5. But the problem with that is it only reveals conscious behaviors that you're willing to reveal. And a lot of our attitudes are reflecting unconscious behaviors. So remember, we had the 3 components of attitude. We had behavior, cognition, and affect. And we can mostly get at definitely cognition with a Likert scale, but we still don't know how you're going to act. And we still don't necessarily know what your feelings are, because you might be acting in a certain way because of a social norm, but you might not feel that way. So it's limited measuring attitudes. What is your attitude toward thus and such? We'll learn something, but we won't learn about your whole attitude. So we could get a little more subtle. We could look at what we call this next one right here, response latency. And when we talk about the word latency, we always mean like a time delay. So how long from the time I ask you the question till the time you answer it? And so that's a little bit more subtlety in there, right? Because now I've asked you a question and I'm going to make note of your answer, but I'm also going to measure how long it takes you to provide that answer. When we do that, I thought I phased all these in, but I guess I didn't. When we do that, we reveal how central the issue is to you. So how important it is to you. So if you're pretty quick to, if I say right away, what is your attitude toward, boy, people know their attitudes right away about masks, right? If I ask you right now, what is your attitude toward masks? You're going to know right away. The latency is going to be small. And that's going to give me an idea that that's pretty central to you. If I ask you, what are your attitudes toward howler monkeys? You might not know, right? You probably don't have a strong attitude. You don't live in a place with howler monkeys. You might even not be entirely sure what they are. Your attitude's probably neutral, and we can measure the time it took. We'll also know, and it's also not very important to you. You know, so that's a subtle way of getting it. And there's a task that we'll be looking at later that maybe you're already familiar with, is association latency. And this one we're going to look later, and you're actually going to take an implicit bias test, but this looks at biases that you don't know you have. And in particular, it looks at bias against social groups, against stereotyped groups of people. And it's used in a lot of like cultural training efforts that we have now to reduce microaggressions in the workplace and things like that. So those are ways that we can do things by asking you or using words. We can also do things by observing. So we can observe, you know, do you recycle, for example? But then we have to ask the question, can we infer your attitude from your behavior? So when I moved from Wisconsin to North Dakota, in Wisconsin, we really, you know, took care to take care of our garbage. We would take all our recycling down to the recycling center very systematically. And when I moved to North Dakota, that wasn't possible. There wasn't a way to recycle. And so at that point, my behavior no longer, I mean, I still did, but we had to drive it 2 hours. So, you know, I recycled when I had a chance to drive to Bismarck. Otherwise, I stored it all. But, you know, the answer might be no, not as much, because it couldn't be done. But it didn't reflect my attitude, you know. So our behaviors don't always reflect attitude. And also, anyone who's observing someone's behavior is placing a judgment, determining what that person is doing. So those are some limitations of observing. We can get the behavioral component of an attitude, but we can't get at feeling, affect, and we can't necessarily get at cognition. through observation. So then we go on to use physiological tests because our bodies, it's hard to make our bodies lie. So if your heart is beating fast and I ask you, are you feeling excited right now, or afraid right now? And you say no, well, then your body is betraying you because your body is saying you are experiencing some sort of arousal right now. What that means, we don't know, but it's some sort of arousal. It could be fear, it could be excitement. So our bodies don't lie very well. So we can look at indicators like blood pressure, skin conductivity for like a measure of arousal, I guess, brain activity. I put ECG, electrocardiogram, but it should be EKG. I think the European abbreviation is ECG, but we should be able to have electroencephalogram, EEG. EKG measures heart rate, but that's also an indicator. And those things are nice because they're measurable and the data are objective, like you're going to get a number and the observer isn't going to be able to change that number. But it does take a long time. You have to have special apparatus, so you're not getting as much data on the spot in real time. So, but that's an interesting idea, isn't it? Like, what can we learn from our bodies? And you can maybe feel different states in your own body. Thoughts on any of those things? Okay. So let's go on.
It kind of reminds me of.
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to say it reminded me of one of my other classes for psychology and law, of how they used the EEG to detect deception in suspects.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes along the same way, the physiological tests and their brain activity.
Were you able to learn that that is not admissible, because the data, we just cannot, there could be a variety of things that would impact EEG results. Yeah, they used to try skin conductance too. If someone feels anxious when a certain question is asked, that was perceived as evidence of lying. But I say this because I came down and studied physiology with Dr. John Allen here at UA, who's one of the big researchers in psychophys. And he does a lot with all of that. And in fact, he was one of the earliest, like for 30 years ago, 25 years ago, probably, working on trying to get polygraphs like that using physiological data to detect lies. But his exact talk when I had him in class was stating that, nope, these are not admissible and they're not reliable for that purpose. They give us valuable information for working with an individual, but there's not like a threshold beyond which a lie is detected. And very often there are mistakes in interpreting it. Anyhow, that's what he said to us, is that he gave us all kinds of evidence of why they're not reliable and why we can't use them in that way. But it's too bad, and it is interesting to play around with those ideas. So we cannot shape behavior. Can we predict your behavior from your attitude? So I'm going to give an example from myself, actually, when I talk about this. So let's just go on though, because I have it written in here. So let me just see where we're going to go with that. Hang on a second. Okay, I have written about this in 2 places, so I'm going to give you this example in a minute. So first of all, we're not that good at predicting someone's behavior from their attitude. So someone might have a bad attitude toward gang members, that example that I gave, but that's not necessarily going to mean that you're going to treat a gang member badly. So just because you have that attitude doesn't lead necessarily to action. So it might be that it's dependent on 2 things. And the first is specificity. So what is your attitude toward? If it's toward like gang members in general, as a group of people who cause harm to young children, and your own experience supports this, even so, if your neighbor son is joined a gang, you might treat that person like an individual. So if the specificity is different, then that might make a difference. And then another factor that makes a difference is how much the representative fits the prototype. So what's a prototype? It's like a model. So if I say chair, everyone gets like an image in their mind of what a chair is. Even though we know that there are thousands and thousands of different kinds of chairs, we have a prototype in our mind. And we have the same for people. If I say teenage girl, something comes into your mind. What are the characteristics of your prototype? If I say gang member, something comes to mind. And what are those characteristics? So if you're representative, in my example, the kid next door who's in a gang, if your representative is similar to your prototype, you're more likely to have a behavior that's consistent with the rest of your attitude, with your thoughts and feelings. So if that boy, you know he's in a gang, but he doesn't really dress like a gangster, and he doesn't maybe swagger in a way that you and your prototype associate with gang members, then you might not apply your attitude toward that example. So that makes sense, right? This is just a little background. But then the next question, can we predict or shape your behavior, your attitude from your behavior? And I put that word or shape in there for a reason, because we're going to look at how if we can change someone's attitude, it might lead to a change in behavior. But if I ask you how you feel about something, if I watch you, if I observe you, can I then infer your attitude? And this picture right here is a picture of an old Aesop's fable. And it's this wolf, I think. And the wolf is trying to get these grapes. The wolf wants the grapes, and he jumps and jumps and he tries to climb and he does everything in his power to get the grapes, and he cannot get them. And so he leaves. He gives up. And does anyone know the moral of this, what he's saying as he leaves and gives up on the grapes? He's dissing the grapes. He's saying, those were probably sour grapes anyhow, right? Those grapes were no good anyhow. Maybe you can see this in little.
Just meant for him to eat it.
Or that what?
Or that he maybe thought like, oh, well, I was probably not supposed to eat it anyways, or.
Yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing.
It wasn't meant for me to eat.
Oh, you guys, that's so beautiful. That's such a healthy, I say Buddhist because I'm more familiar with that paradigm. It may well be a Dene perspective. But it's absolutely beautiful. But no, the Aesop's fable, he's doing that. I suppose maybe it's a more Western thing. It's a Western fable because he's saying, those grapes weren't any good anyhow. And you can see certainly in Western tradition, you could see like a teenager doing this. They have sort of they want to go on a date with somebody and they ask that person out on the date and the person declines. Maybe wise tradition that you perhaps have, and that might be more Buddhist, would be to say, well, this wasn't meant to be, this wasn't intended. But in an immature way, they might say, she wasn't that pretty anyhow, or I don't like her that much anyhow, something like that. Sour grapes, it's called. This is so interesting, this perspective you just offered on that.
I wanted to say something real quick.
Yeah.
I think we were kind of misled just from the artwork and the expression on the artwork, because in Navajo we also have the coyote, and we know coyote has a bad attitude.
Oh, okay.
So I think it kind of like in the Navajo coyote stories, it would be just like him to say, oh, those are probably sour anyways. He has an attitude like that, I think. I think we were just kind of misled just because in the facial expression on the artwork. I think that's where we got kind of misled.
Yeah, it doesn't look much like a wolf, I don't think, but.
No, I mean, his facial expression, it kind of says, well, maybe I wasn't supposed to do it anyways. I think that's where it was read culturally different, but I just wanted to remind
everyone. Would coyote really say that in the Dene? Like, do you think that would be a reaction, a sour grapes reaction in the Dene tradition? Would that be true of coyote, or
I think so, because Coyote, he's a trickster, and he's known to have a bad attitude, and to just, he would say something like that, like, oh, those are probably just sour anyways.
Huh, that's interesting.
I don't know if you guys agree, or what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think from Coyote's perspective, it would be leaning towards, what you interpreted as him noting that the grapes are sour. But I think as far as, the story being told to us as the youth, and I think we would ask the youth, if now that we're the adults, now, and we have kids, I think us telling the story, we would ask them their interpretation, and they would probably lean towards that maybe they're not for him, maybe they're not, it's not his to have. But I think from Coyote's perspective, I think he would I have no doubt that he would say those grapes are sour. Yeah.
So is the coyote in the Dene tradition, is it sort of an immature, is that the nature of the coyote, sort of immature in that way, like not wise, not thinking, is he sort of gratified by sensory desires and that sort of thing?
Yeah, more towards mischievous, and his behaviors or that of pretty much teachings to us, Dene.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah,
pretty
that's
much
what I
like,
was thinking also. Like he's,
go ahead.
oh no, I was agreeing with you of how like for the coyote stories, we see them more like he's teaching us what not to do. So
Yeah.
It automatically makes you think of, oh, well, he walked away from it because there was something wrong with the grapes. So if it kind of, I don't know, I guess you would say the moral would be, if you can't reach the grapes, or if there's no way for you to get it, then it's probably not meant for you to have those grapes.
So then that extra step is what this guy did, this coyote, will just, or this wolf, I guess, but as he walked away from it, but instead of taking that mature perspective, the grapes are still good grapes, but they're not intended for me, which takes a level of self-discipline. Maybe the childish perspective before someone learns might be to make yourself feel better by dissing the thing you can't have, by disrespecting the thing you can't have. So perhaps it is a maturity thing, right? Maybe? I don't really know. I'm just wondering, but I think of a mature reaction, holding respect for the object that you can't have, and an immature reaction, putting it down, maybe. I don't know. That's very interesting. We do see more examples of this. Let's see if I can get this to move. Oh, I guess I had a video there. Okay, so our attitudes can be inconsistent. Like we just saw that this fox, oh, it's a fox is what it is, not a wolf. The fox in the grapes is the story. The fox changed his attitude toward the grapes, right? Initially, his attitude was very positive, and then when his behavior could not align with his attitude, his behavior of eating the grapes could not align with his thoughts and feelings about the grapes, then he had to resolve that. And so first we'll talk about the inconsistencies and then about the resolutions. So it might be that, in what ways can attitudes be inconsistent? It might be that you have two attitudes, two strong attitudes. But these two strong attitudes both are in opposite directions toward the same object. And so my little example here that happens with me is I really have a negative attitude toward wasting food. I don't like it, doesn't feel right to me. And I also have a negative attitude toward eating too much because I don't like to be uncomfortable. So do you see the inconsistency now? If I get too much on my plate, then I'm forced, then I have a dissonance, then there's tension between two attitudes in conflict. So that's my quick example. Do any of you have an example like this? And this specific example is, You have two separate attitudes that both conflict on the same object that has characteristics of both. I can think about my dad, whom I love very much and enjoy, who has beliefs that I don't agree with at all. And so when I'm with my dad, I have to resolve a little bit of that dissonance when I'm with him as well. My love, my attitude of love and enjoyment of my dad in conflict with my attitude against some of the beliefs that he holds. You see, dissonance, there's a little tension that I need to resolve. Are there any examples of this for any of you? And if not, we just keep moving here.
I like getting good grades, but I tend to procrastinate every now and then. So, so.
Is there anyone who doesn't? I would like to meet you and learn your trick. Yeah, I tend to. Most all of us do. Or my son has an attitude right now that says he should finish his degree, and he's doing that. And he's a little older, he's 30. And but he knows he needs to finish it. He started and left with just a year or so. And so then he also has an attitude that says he should be contributing to the world, not sitting home in front of his computer. And so I think for him, that's dissonant. Like he's got to work, he's got to resolve it because he feels like at this stage he should be working more actively in the world. All right, this is the second way attitudes can be inconsistent. Different components of one attitude may not align. And this is the example I was going to give you earlier. So you might have misalignment, say, between your thinking and your feeling. This is the most common misalignment, and your behavior may get in there as well. So this is my problem, is you might have a vegetarian who likes meat. And that sounds like an oxymoron, and it is. And so this is where I come from. So I don't like the way animals are treated in this world that I live in. And I think that that's different, maybe, up in Diné country. But for me, where I live, animals are not treated well. And I don't know how to get meat from animals that are treated well. We're raising animals on land in ways that degrade the land and waste our resources, feeding animals. And we also eat way too much meat. And so there's a whole bunch of cognitive reasons why I want to be vegetarian. And behaviorally, okay, I'm doing it. You know, I don't cook meat at home. I don't order meat when I go out. I do eat meat if I'm offered it to it, like in someone's home. They serve it to me, then I, of course, take and accept it with gratitude. But this is my dissonance affectively, is I like meat. I really like the taste of meat and the texture. I miss it. I don't know what to cook for meals very often because I was raised with meat. I'm always trying to like, oh, if I prepare these dried mushrooms in just this way, they seem kind of like meat, you know, so that's dissonance. So that's what is happening with me. And that's what this picture was supposed to be representing, is that like, it's hard. My affect is in conflict with my cognition and my behavior. And so I'm letting my cognition rule, but affectively it's hard, you know. So I don't know. That's my little example. Do you have any sort of example? If you have some, you'll think of them and share them, and I hope you'll interrupt me to do so.
I have one that's kind of similar where I try not to eat too much meat, and I like to eat seafood though.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so the seafood that we eat, can they feel, do they have a mind? Like, we know mammals can think, and, you know, I like, you know, I will eat meat. I do like meat, but I try to cut down as much as I can because I think it's sad and it's cruel. But I don't have a problem with seafood, so I don't know.
Yeah, I know. And then you read about, say, how the harvesting practices of the animals, even that word I don't like, of the seafood, come up and kill so many other creatures when they're doing these wide nets across the bottom of the ocean floor, or then I just get tangled in thinking like that. And this isn't a judgment on other people. So I don't want anyone to feel that way, because it's taken me a lot of years to make this decision. But I would say that my son decided to resolve it by they don't eat it unless they have taken it. Like, so if they go fishing and catch a fish, then they will eat the fish. But both he and his wife said that they don't really like to kill that wasn't a part of something that they enjoyed doing together. So they haven't adjusted to that either. So he's reconciling it himself, I guess. So anyhow, that's kind of thing that can happen, especially when we're trying to make big changes. And this is what's called cognitive dissonance. And so every time I deal with it, like every time I get a big craving for meat, and then every now and then I'll give in, and I'll eat. And then I have this like kind of this self-condemnation. It's like a tension. It's like on my next slide, I don't think I'm going to play it, but I have this tritone. Have you ever heard chords on a piano when someone hits two notes that clash and the frequencies don't align, and it hurts your ears? And that's this feeling of dissonance. And this dissonance is one of the most uncomfortable feelings that a person can have. I mean, it's mental stress. When you have dissonance, when you're engaging in a behavior or an action that is in conflict with your values, or when you have a difference between your feelings and your thoughts, this is stress on the body. It can be more than just discomfort. It depends on how strongly it is. Like if you had to kill people in the war and you strongly believe that you shouldn't, I mean, this would be a stressor on your body that might even harm your health. So just reading the definition, because this is our big key concept today. Cognitive dissonance, mental stress or discomfort experienced by an individual or culture who holds contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values, which can give rise to irrational and sometimes maladaptive behavior. So this stress might lead you to act not in the best interest of yourself or others, and it won't even necessarily feel rational to you. So dissonance, like two notes on the piano that aren't blending. So this idea is by Festinger, and I'm going to tell you about two of his experiments in a minute. So if we hold two conflicting attitudes in our mind, we can get all this anxiety and tension, like someone who knows smoking is unhealthy and continues to smoke. Every time they light that cigarette, they might have that feeling of discomfort. Okay, and it's such a profound feeling that they may seek to resolve it. Now, whenever I try to play a little video in this class, it doesn't work out. It seems to buffer slowly, but let me just see if I can pull this up for you. Otherwise, I have it posted on our Blackboard page as well. But if it'll play up, he does a nice job of explaining Festinger's
and they maintain
study.
that,
And it looks like it's choppy.
real experiment diverges into three different groups.
Yeah, nope.
In the first control
It's not
group,
able to
they
do
simply
it. So,
tell them that little story about the Confederate, how they tell them how exciting it is.
hang on, let me just find the stop button for him. All right, so I can't show you the little video, but you can watch it later. So the idea is we really want to reduce dissonance. We don't like it, but how do we reduce dissonance? All right. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but we want to get rid of any dissonance. So let's apply this to real life. What this is supposed to be a picture of is a hazing incident in a fraternity. So we have, and our goal is we want to reduce dissonance. Let me just see if I have our studies. Hold on a second. Okay, I do. I wanted to make sure I didn't forget a slide here. All right, I don't think I actually have, I don't have Festinger study on here. I'm going to just pull something else up, and because somehow I missed putting it in here, but I have it in a different package. So let me just grab it. I want to tell you about two studies of the work by Festinger.
Can dissonance create a sort of trauma as well?
I think if it was pretty severe, it sure could.
And would
Like-
that like interplay with like past experiences as well? Like maybe, for example, let's say someone did go off to war and then they come back, and then, 4th of July comes around and the firecracker goes off, and they like, you know, being a patriot and then enjoying what they did for their country, but then at the same time, 4th of July comes around, celebrating, independence and whatnot, and being patriotic, but then at the same time, they don't like that holiday because of, there's fireworks and there's a lot of commotion, and will that play onto like a traumatic experience? Like, will that?
I mean, I
interplay?
think so. You're talking about probably some post-traumatic stress disorder,
Yeah.
which is in most cases, a classically conditioned response associating some sort of a stimulus like a loud explosion with a pronounced fear or negative event, and they're linked in your mind in a classically conditioned way. And so often that occurs because an individual never processed the trauma. And by processing, I almost mean when I say that one has to take out the event and observe it outside of the self. But if the event is stored tight and maybe the person couldn't sleep during sleep, we sometimes process, but maybe sleep was disrupted for a variety of reasons. There's been no processing that took place, then that remains linked. And then the more that linkage is followed through repeated actions or repeated activations of neural pathways, then the stronger that reaction gets. And then an individual would need to have help in resolving it at a later time because it would be pretty deep, So that's what we think of as PTSD. And then you're moving on to say, is there some possibility that this PTSD or this reaction to trauma could be dissonant with like the 4th of July events that sort of celebrate war? So now this person has this traumatic reaction and experience in war. And even though he or she honors the work they did in the war, they still have this reaction to the sounds of it. And so then could we have dissonance compounding the existing trauma? I mean, and I'd say definitely. I mean, definitely there could be dissonance there. And it just seems to me that the person is going to need to unpack a lot of stuff in that event, because first off, they have a trauma that hasn't been dealt with. If they're still having that reaction to it, then the only way to get rid of a reaction like that is to have a repeat of the stimulus without the bad outcomes. And so that's the way to dissociate those two, but that's going to take time and work. And then this person probably needs to, in their mind, process that memory. And then finally, they have to be able to talk through the dissonant feelings that they're having, so that when they start to have that affective feeling of revulsion, maybe, or whatever the emotion is going to the 4th of July things, then they have to be able to observe that feeling in themselves and say, this is, and identify it and name it, and then rise above it. So there's a lot of processing that would need to happen.
Okay.
And so now these are the Festinger studies, and they're so weird. And they're counterintuitive. So this is the first study, and in this little clip, you'll be able to see more of it, but I can't play clips with you in this class. But so he's got subjects randomly assigned to 1 or 2 conditions. So these are college undergraduates, and they come into, they're paid to come in and do a task. Okay, and so they come in and the task is very boring. It involves like a block full of pegs, and they have to turn each one 90 degrees and then turn each one back again, or like move a set of pegs from one container to the other one at a time and then move them back again. Very boring tasks. And actually the study was done in a couple different ways. And the one that I posed here, subjects were paid $50. So after they were all done with the task, they were about to leave, they were going to get their extra credit. And then the researcher said one of two things. Either the researcher said to them, hey, I'm really sorry, this is kind of embarrassing, but the person who was supposed to replace me it didn't show up. And we'll pay you $50 if you'll just sit down here, and all you need to do is like get this person started, and then we'd like you to tell them that this was a really interesting task and that you liked it. So basically they're instructed to lie because there's no way anyone would like the task, and they're offered $50 to do so. And in condition 2, same thing. Hey, I'm really sorry to ask this of you, but this person didn't show up, and we can pay you $2 if you'd be willing to just sit here and, tell the next people who come in that this was a good task, that you liked it, and, would you mind? And so what they measured in the end is how much after they did this, they said they liked the task. Now, mind you, nobody would like the task genuinely because it's really boring. Okay, so I think they set that up ahead of time and checked it and made sure that nobody likes the task. All right. And so now, which group do you think, after they either sat down and lied for $50 or sat down and lied for $2, which group do you think liked the task more afterwards?
Probably the one that got paid the $50.
They liked the task more? And that's what I always
Yes,
would want to say
because
too. Go ahead, Kay.
Oh no, I was gonna say because of the fact that they got $50. It had nothing to do with the actual task that they did or the study itself, just the idea of having $50, I guess.
Maybe like an association. Now they've linked this task to $50. Yeah, I think that could be a credible point here, actually. But what actually happened in the study is the opposite. The ones who were paid $2 increased their liking for it. And why? And this is the underpinning of cognitive dissonance theory. Because lying is something most people don't want to do. So let's assume they have an attitude that says don't lie. And then let's assume that $2 isn't very much money. And so now for just $2, they've lied. They've told someone they like the task. And so how do they reduce the dissonance? They convince themselves that they actually had liked the task more than they thought. Then they're not lying anymore, right? That's Festinger's theory, and it's this kind of study that's right at the start of it. So I'll give you another example. This should have come before the last one. Subjects, and this is another Festinger study, and this took place way back in the 50s, and it was a very modest time. People did not say sexually explicit words out loud, especially women, and these were female college undergraduates, and they wanted to become part of this organization that's going to talk about progressive issues. And so these are all women who want to join this organization, young women, young college students. And in condition 1, in order to join the club, they had to read a highly embarrassing, sexually explicit passage aloud to an audience with some really, really nasty words in it. And in condition 2, they had to read just a mildly embarrassing sexual passage aloud. Which group, and the dependent variable was how much they liked the club. Which group do you think, condition 1 or condition 2, liked the club more after they gained admittance? The ones who had to read a mildly embarrassing package or an extremely embarrassing passage? What would dissonance theory predict? And in this case, the ones who had to read the mildly embarrassing passage liked the club more. They had to, because they didn't get much for it. So in the case where they had to read a really embarrassing passage, then they could be honest about what they were feeling. But if they just did a little bit, then they have to justify how much they liked the club. In this first case, I don't think I was clear by saying, if you had been given $50 to tell this lie, you might be able to say, man, I had to tell that lie, but it was for $50, you know, and that can buy groceries for 2 weeks, you know. So it's okay that I told the lie. So they didn't have to convince themselves that they liked the task. But if they did it for just a little bit, then they had to reconcile the dissonance differently by liking the task more. And so this is where I was going to with this, with the gang stuff, was to say, if you think of this, why do fraternities haze their new members? They put them into very bad and embarrassing situations and punish them painfully. I mean, hazing causes death. But if this dissonance theory is true, then these fraternity guys are going to be all the more dedicated to that because of what they allowed themselves to endure. I endured it because this is such a valuable club to me. And it's the same maybe with rites of passage. If you have to go through a rite of passage to become a member of a group, then you're going to value that group more according to dissonance theory because of how much you had to do to get it. So we can think of some of those as being relevant. And now I'm going to get back into the other version of this that I had. So do those studies really make sense at all? They're kind of weird studies. We can ask about them later because I want to just get through the rest of this a little bit. How do we reduce dissonance? We can change behavior, or we can change our attitude. And in the case of the behavior of lying about how much they like the task, they had to change their attitude. They couldn't change the behavior. In the case where they got enough money for it, they could rationalize. They could say, well, I got enough money for it, so it was okay. So we can change our behavior, we can change our attitude, or we can rationalize. So that's how we can reduce dissonance. And when does this inconsistency produce dissonance? So dissonance is caused by inconsistency in our attitude. And if it's freely chosen, that is going to produce dissonance. So if I chose to do this thing that is outside of my value system, then I'm going to have more dissonance. If I can't justify it, like I didn't get paid $50 to lie, I got paid $2 and I lied anyhow, that's going to be dissonance, and I'd have to reduce it in some way by changing my attitude in this case. Or if there are negative consequences that I should have foreseen, then I'm going to have dissonance. Like if you went out with the same kind of person again and again and again, and you got into the same situation and you should have been able to foresee it, then you're more likely to have dissonance because of your over your actions that are inconsistent with your values. So reducing dissonance is a big goal of attitude change and behaviors. Now, I said we're going to talk about attitude change. And so let's go on from here. And maybe this will be relevant to Jeremy's. I think we have about 5 or 6, 7 more minutes, maybe. So how do we change someone's attitude? Can we induce someone? Can we reward someone to change their attitude? Or can we only change a behavior? And the first that I really heard about this was way back when I was a teacher. I was listening to a researcher, Alfie Kohn, who talks a lot about the problems of giving children rewards for their activities. And this was one study that he talked about. And in the independent variable, they had a beverage that they were just going to invite children to drink. And the beverage was called kefir, and maybe you know it, and it's kind of a weird one. It's like Greek yogurt, it's got lots of antioxidants. It's a kind of a weird, it's got a lot of probiotics, and so kids won't necessarily like it. It's not horrible, but it's not great. And so they gave all these children this drink of kefir. And in the first condition, there was nothing. There was no induction. The children weren't being induced. They were just told, here's some kefir, and set down in front of them. And then the second condition, they were told, here's some kefir. If you finish it, you can have a cookie. Okay, so they gave them a reward for it. And then the first condition, no reward. And the dependent variable was a change in behavior. Would you drink kefir again sometime? And a change in attitude. And let's just say aspect of attitude. How much do you like kefir? And we found that children in condition 2 who were induced were less likely to like it and less likely to agree that they would drink it again. Why? Well, if you have to pay me to drink this stuff, it must be pretty nasty, right? And the reason Alfie Kohn was bringing this up to us was because of all the rewards that we give kids in school. Like at that time, there was a big behaviorist paradigm in our schools where we were rewarding kids for reading books and for just about everything, the whole, for doing something kind for another kid, and they were earning stickers and earning little incentives for everything. And he was really opposed to that for this reason, because when you reward someone, kids will begin to do it for the reward, but they will be less likely to do it when the reward is no longer present. Thoughts on this? I have another example. It's called temporary compliance. Okay, the next one is the forbidden toy paradigm. This one's in your book. And the setup is they just gave 4-year-old children a set of 4 toys, and each, maybe it was 5 toys, and asked the children to rate how much they like each toy, like to rank the toys in order of how much they like them. And left the room, and the children were told they could play with any of the toys except whichever one that child had identified as his second favorite. And all the children obeyed. And the difference is in the independent variable, children were randomly told either a mild threat, if you do play with that toy, I'm going to be very annoyed. Just a mild threat. Or a severe threat. If you play with that toy, I will be very, very angry, and I will take all the toys home and never come back again. And the dependent variable was their change in attitude toward the forbidden toy. And just as happened in those original dissonance paradigms, the children in condition 2 still liked the toy just as much, but the children in condition 1 reduced their liking for the toy. In condition 2, they could rationalize, oh, I really like that toy, but oh, that person is going to get very angry if I play with it. They could rationalize why they didn't play with it. But in children 1, they couldn't rationalize. The researcher's just going to get a little annoyed. And so they had to decide that actually they didn't like that toy that much anyhow. And you can see the results here. So the blue bar is representing the devaluation of the toy, the percent of subjects, the threat condition, and how much they like their liking for the toy increased, decreased, or stayed the same. And in this mild threat condition, the researcher is just going to be annoyed. We see that many of the children decreased their liking for the toy, whereas the children in the heavy threat condition increased their liking for the toy much more frequently. And so this is just happening. It's almost like a sour grapes phenomenon. If I can't play with the toy, if I can't have the grapes, they must not be very good grapes. If I can't play with the toy, then it's not a very good toy. So, and this was another way that I was going to explain it. And that was just to reduce dissonance. Then I just have 2 more quick little slides for you. How much... All right, so here this child loves her strawberry cake or whatever that is, okay? And now she's told, well, if you eat your peas, you can have your strawberry cake. And the attitude of interest is going to be her liking for the peas, all right? How much is she going to like the peas? And how much is she going to like the cake after this experiment? And so her liking for the peas, if they're rewarded with the cake, is going to decrease, and her liking for the cake is going to increase. Because now she's had to endure this negative thing in order to get what she already likes. And it's called the Premack principle. If A, then B, but then A gets liked less. Does that make sense? All right. And I think we'll actually wrap up here. Here I likened it to the child getting pizza coupons, which they used to give in exchange for reading a book. And so then how much is the child going to like the book? Less. And how much are they going to like the pizza? More. So that's kind of a reverse, or like a reverse effect that happens when we give kids a lot of rewards for things they don't want to do. So this is the content that I had for you. I have a little bit more on here, but we don't need to do it all. I did miss a couple of things. All right, I'm going to put a recording up of this embodied cognition and the arousal, misattribution of arousal, because it's so fascinating and I had not timed it quite right, and the facial feedback hypothesis. So I'm going to put those all up there. And this is your reflection for this week, though. What I'm actually wanting you to do is to work on seeing if you can, I didn't give you guys tasks to do this semester, but I want you to work on seeing if you can engage one of these experiments. This chapter is full of experiments. I've talked to you about a few of them, but I want to see if you can just not do an experiment, but just try these things out. Like if you have a child, you could try it with your child. Take a dessert that even take something that they don't like that much and tell them, if you do this, then you can have that, and then measure their liking. So I put a few ideas down. You could try to induce compliance and see what happens. You could explore dissonance. I put down, maybe you or someone you love has beliefs that are in conflict, like believing that stealing is wrong and yet keeping the extra change the store clerk just handed them. So maybe you'll just talk to them and write about them. But remember, you always want to we always want to remember that we ourselves have all of these flaws that we see so easily in others. And so this would need to be a very gentle, like a conversation where you're probing to learn more about how this functions for them, how they resolve the dissonance, not in a judgmental way. That's always really important. And anytime we use behavioral paradigms to induce compliance, we're manipulating somebody. So we have to be really mindful and always tell them afterwards, what we were doing. Forbidden fruit is in this story. It's one that I didn't get to right at the end here, but it's just the idea that here are a bunch of boxes and you can look in every box except this one. And then you measure in this person, how much do they want to look in that box or even watch later to see if they peek, So that's what I'm asking you to do, is to try something out, and then you'll be either writing about it in a blog or in a journal. And then maybe from there, you'll choose a couple of other ideas that might make it relevant to your experience. But that'll be where we're going this week with the reflection, and I'll write it up more neatly than this. I didn't put it up yet for you, but I'll put it up more neatly than this. But this is where we're going this week, is to play with some of these ideas in our own real lives. Any questions or comments on this? I'll stop sharing.
I think I'm pretty good. That was an interesting take on attitudes and behavior.
Yeah, it is fascinating if we think about it. That last little bit that we didn't get to looks more at the role of emotion or affect and how we sometimes misidentify our own emotion. Like, this is even a psychological trick that you could play with yourself if you're feeling fear. Like, the sense of arousal for fear physiologically is the same as it is for excitement. And so you can play a trick on yourself and tell yourself that that fear that you're feeling over maybe something, like climbing or heights or something, that it's excitement. And if you can convince yourself that what you're interpreting as fear is actually excitement, you can change your attitude toward it. It's an interesting thing you can do, because our physiological responses are not unique to an emotion. We interpret our physiological responses. Do we do it right or wrong? So that misattribution of arousal, that bridge that you saw, that's a study that I was going to share with you, but not time here, but I'll record it after this. All right, everyone. I'm glad you came. Thank you. I didn't hear from all of you, but it's really nice to see you. And I'll be up in Dene before the election. So I hope I might get to meet some of you from 6 feet distance, I suppose, and outside, I suppose, but maybe that opportunity will arise. And just, I'll say it again, I will get tested before I come and make sure that I'm not bringing anything to you that way. Okay. All right.
All righty.
See you
See you,
soon.
everybody.
Okay, thank you. It was a good lecture.
Fun stuff.